The morning Vance Brackett's men finally rode in to take the Penn place. They came 8 strong, armed and impatient, and very plainly meant to frighten, with the foreman Cy Mullen at their head and 7 of Brackett's hardest hands strung out, behind him on the long dust road up to her gate. They had ridden out from the big house at the Brackett Ranch, convinced this would be the morning that broke her, that a widow alone, watching 8 armed men come up the road for her land, would finally understand that her refusing was over, and her selling at last begun. And the widow Mariah Penn met them alone on her own front porch in her clean apron, and her hair pinned back, with a coffee cup steady in her hand, and her shotgun resting unloaded on a chair beside her. And she looked at Cy Mullen and at the 7 men ranged behind him, and she did not blink. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for the gun. She told them, quite plainly, that she had nothing further to say to Mr. Brackett, that her answer remained the answer it had always been, and that they might now leave her porch. What they did not know, what the cattle baron did not know, what no soul in the dry sage country knew except the widow herself, was that Mariah Penn had not been brave that morning because she was foolish. She had been brave because she had been quietly, carefully preparing for that morning for the better part of 2 years. She had been married for 19 good years to Andrew Penn, a quiet, hard-working rancher who had built up the small Penn, spread from nothing but a Homestead Act claim and a great deal of stubborn labor. 320 acres, the Penn place was, not a large spread by dry sage standards, but it had on it the one feature that mattered most in that dry corner of the territory, a year-round spring, fed by the deep aquifer under the dry sage hills that ran clean and steady through every season. Andrew Penn had understood the value of that spring from the day he had filed his claim. So had Mariah. Together they had made of the small ranch a thriving thing, on the strength of water that all the bigger spreads around them had to haul in or do without. Andrew had died 3 winters before the morning of the standoff, of a fall from a horse on the high pasture. He had been 50. Mariah, then 44, had buried him beside their first claim stake on a windswept rise above the spring, and had set herself to keeping the Penn place running. There had been only one hired hand, an old cowboy named Otis Stebbings, who had been with Andrew since their first hard year, and the 2 of them had managed the place alone, quietly, capably. The trouble had started in Mariah's 2nd year as a widow, when Vance Brackett at last decided that the Penn place's spring was the missing piece of his ambitions for the dry sage country. Vance Brackett owned the Brackett Land and Cattle Company, 8,000 acres in the dry sage, the largest spread in the county, built on his late father's holdings and grown by his own ruthless management into a power that the small ranchers feared without quite naming. Brackett's spread had several seasonal water sources but no year-round spring on his own land. In dry summers his herds suffered, and his expansion was limited. The Penn place's spring was the key that would unlock everything for him. He had begun politely. He had ridden over to the Penn place himself one autumn afternoon in Mariah's 2nd year of widowhood, paid his condolences for Andrew's death, and made her a fair offer, more than the small spread would have brought on the open market. Mariah had heard him out, served him coffee, and quietly refused. The Penn place was not for sale. It was Andrew's land and hers, and she meant to keep it. Brackett had returned twice more in the year that followed, each time with a higher offer and a slightly harder edge. Each time Mariah had refused with the same quiet steadiness. By the 3rd refusal, his veneer of patience had begun to crack. There had been remarks in town about widows who did not understand their own best interests. There had been, twice, fences down that Otis had not put down. There had been a small fire in the brush near her south pasture that had not started itself, and Mariah Penn, who was not the helpless woman Brackett had taken her for, had understood at last that polite refusals were not enough. Sooner or later, Brackett would come for the spring by other means. When he did, she meant to be ready. So in her 3rd year as a widow, quietly, telling no one, not even Otis, she had begun to prepare. She had done 3 careful things, none of which the dry sage country had noticed. The first had been a journey. 2 springs before the morning of the standoff, Mariah Penn had ridden the long stage to the Territorial capital, telling Otis only that she had family business to settle and had spent 4 days at the Territorial Land Office. She had brought every paper Andrew had ever filed: the original Homestead Act patent, the survey, the witness deed, the tax records, the title abstract. She had paid for a formal recertification of her title under her own name as Andrew's surviving spouse, witnessed by a United States Marshal who had happened to be in the capital that week. She walked out with the most thoroughly documented, federally recognized title to her 320 acres that any small rancher in the territory possessed. The second thing she had done was to file, separately, a formal claim under the Desert Land Act for the water rights of her spring, registered with the Federal Land Office, witnessed, paid for, recorded, so that her water rights had the protection of federal law as well as territorial title. The third thing she had done, quietly, in a letter sent by stage out of Dry Sage Junction, was to write to a man named Hollis Wynn, in another county 400 miles east, asking for his counsel. Hollis Wynn had been her late husband's closest friend in the world. He and Andrew Penn had ridden together in the same cavalry company during the war, had been each other's best men at each other's weddings, and had stayed friends ever since. Hollis had settled after the war in a county east of the Dry Sage, where he had made a quiet life as a small rancher and acquired a working acquaintance with the territorial federal courts and a friendship with a circuit federal judge named Reynolds. Andrew had said, more than once, that Hollis Wynn was the most honorable man he had ever known. Mariah had written to him plainly, explained Brackett's pressure, her refusal, her 3 preparations, and asked him, as Andrew's oldest friend, for his counsel and his help, if and when the matter came to a head. That had been 2 months before the morning of the standoff. She had not yet had his reply, but she had done what she could. They had timed it carefully. Otis had been sent into Dry Sage Junction the day before on a manufactured errand involving a sick neighbor's horse and would not be back until late afternoon. Mariah was effectively alone. They came up the road just after the early breakfast hour, dust rising behind them, and reined up in a half circle in her yard. Mariah Penn had heard them coming for a quarter of a mile. She had set down her cooking, smoothed her apron, pinned back her hair, and walked out to her porch with her coffee cup. She had set the unloaded shotgun on the chair beside her, not because she meant to use it, but because Cy Mullen and his men needed to see that she was not unarmed. And she had stood at the porch rail when they reined up, and she had looked at them. Cy Mullen took off his hat, with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mrs. Penn," he said, "Mr. Brackett sent me. He's done with offering. He wants you to understand your situation." "I understand my situation," Mariah said. "It is the same situation it has been for 2 years. My answer is the same. The Penn place is not for sale. Now I'd like you to leave." Mullen's smile widened. "Mrs. Penn, I'd like to do that, but Mr. Brackett's instructed me to inform you that by tomorrow morning he will be filing a formal claim against your spring with the Territorial Land Office. He has 2 sworn witnesses prepared to testify that your late husband acknowledged a debt of $4,000 to him, owed at the time of his death, payable in land or water rights. The court will rule for him. You will lose this place and the spring by the autumn term. He is offering you now one last chance to sell at the price he last offered before you lose everything." There was a long silence. The 8 horses shifted in the yard. Mariah Penn looked steady at Cy Mullen, and she did not blink. "Mr. Mullen," she said at last, "I do not believe one word your employer has just instructed you to tell me. My husband owed Mr. Brackett no debt. He never met Mr. Brackett in person and conducted no business with him. Your witnesses are lying, but you may inform Mr. Brackett that I have heard him. My answer remains no, and he is welcome to file whatever claim he wishes, and I am welcome to meet it. Now leave." For a long moment no one moved. Cy Mullen had not expected steadiness. He had expected tears and reluctant signature. He sat his horse a long, unhappy moment, weighing whether to escalate. But 8 armed men in a yard threatening a single unmoving woman who did not flinch looked, even to themselves, like cowards. Mullen put his hat back on, nodded to his men, and the 8 turned their horses and rode out at a slow walk. Mariah Penn stood on her porch until they were out of sight. Then she set down her coffee cup. Her hands were shaking. She gripped the porch rail and held herself steady, because she had not let them see her shake, and she was not going to let herself shake even now. She had not blinked, and before the dust of their leaving had settled, a single rider, a man on a tired bay horse, came up the road from the opposite direction and rode quietly into her yard and reined up at her porch. He was older, perhaps 55, weathered and gray at the temples, with the kind eyes Andrew Penn had described to her in 100 long evening conversations. He took off his hat. "Mrs. Penn, I am Hollis Wynne. I had your letter. I came as soon as I could. I see," he added, looking after the dust of the 8 riders. "I have arrived not a moment too soon." Mariah Penn, who had not let herself weep in 3 years, sat down very suddenly on her porch step and put her face in her hands for a moment, in the great relief of having Andrew's oldest friend at last on her porch. Then she stood up, dried her eyes briskly, and said, "Mr. Wynne, thank you for coming. A circuit federal judge named Reynolds is in Dry Sage Junction in 8 days. Will you help me?" "I will, Mrs. Penn," said Hollis Wynne. "I came to." What unfolded over the 8 days that followed, and the court session after, was the unmaking of Vance Brackett's plan, and the slow making of something else neither Mariah nor Hollis had expected. Hollis Wynne, in those days, was a working revelation. He knew the federal courts and the law on territorial title and water rights, and he listened gravely to Mariah's whole account of her 2 years of preparation. "Andrew was right to marry you, Mrs. Penn," he said. "You have built a fortress of paper around this ranch without anyone seeing you do it. There is almost no chance Brackett's fraudulent claim survives a hearing before Judge Reynolds. We need only present what you already have." They prepared together for the hearing. They went through Andrew's records, every receipt, ledger, signed paper, and there was no record anywhere of any debt owed to Brackett, for the plain reason no such debt had ever existed. They took sworn statements from Otis Stebbings, from the doctor who had attended Andrew's last hours, and from the parson who had buried him, none of whom had ever heard of any debt or any visit by any agent of Brackett's. Hollis drafted a careful brief. He requested, through Judge Reynolds's clerk, that Brackett's 2 witnesses be required to testify under oath in open court. The hearing in Dry Sage Junction lasted 1 full day. Vance Brackett came in person in a fine coat with his foreman, his 2 false witnesses, and his town lawyer. Mariah Penn came in her best plain dress with her territorial title certification, her federal water rights claim, Andrew's complete records, sworn statements from Otis and the doctor and the parson, and the quiet, steady presence of Hollis Wynne at her side. Judge Reynolds, a careful older man with a deep distaste for perjury, listened to Brackett's witnesses tell their story of the supposed deathbed, debt, and then let Hollis cross-examine them. Within an hour, both witnesses had contradicted themselves, contradicted each other, and been caught in 3 plain falsehoods about dates and places. By the end of the day, Judge Reynolds had dismissed Brackett's claim, ordered the witnesses bound over for perjury investigation, confirmed Mariah's title and water rights, and warned Brackett on the open record that any further harassment would be heard in his court personally. Brackett walked out a publicly humiliated man. Mariah Penn had won, and Hollis Wynne, who had ridden in to honor his old friend Andrew's memory and stand by the widow Andrew had loved, did not immediately ride home after the hearing. He stayed in the Dry Sage country a few weeks more, to help Otis with the fall work, to be available in case Brackett tried any further mischief. And in those weeks, Mariah Penn and Hollis Wynne came to know each other. What they came to know, slowly, both careful, was something neither had quite admitted to themselves before. Hollis had loved Mariah Penn at a careful distance for nearly 20 years, in the unspoken, honorable way that a man can love his best friend's wife. Never said, never acted on. Andrew's death had not changed it, except to make it grief instead of restraint. Mariah, alone and braced for 3 years, knowing nothing of his feeling, found in his steady, honorable presence a warmth she had not let herself want. Hollis at last said it gently, on a fall evening at her porch rail. "Mariah, I owe you the truth. I have loved you, in the careful way a friend can, for the better part of 20 years. Andrew knew it, I think. He was too sharp not to, and trusted me with you. I did not come for that. I came to honor him, but I find I cannot ride home and pretend any longer that what I feel is only old friendship. If you would have me, when enough time has passed, I would be your husband. Until then, I am simply here. You are not alone, Mariah, and you will not be again." Mariah Penn, who had not blinked at 8 armed men and had not wept in 3 years of widowhood, did weep at that, quietly, gratefully, and she took his weathered hand in both of hers and she said, "Hollis win. Andrew was right. You are the most honorable man I have ever known. Yes, when the time is right." Yes, they married the following spring on the rise above the spring, with Otis Stebbings as witness and Judge Reynolds himself riding out to perform the ceremony. The Penn place stayed Mariah's. Hollis joined his small holdings to hers, and the two of them ran the spread together for the long, good years that followed. And Dry Sage Country told the story for a long time. 8 of Brackett's men rode up that road to take the widow's land, the old-timers would say. She met them alone on her porch and didn't blink. That's the part everyone remembers. They'd lower their voices. But the truer part is what nobody knew at the time. She'd been preparing for that morning for 2 solid years. Territorial title, Federal Water Rights, a letter to Andrew's old friend Hollis. She wasn't brave because she was a fool. She was brave because she had done the work. Courage on the frontier was never the absence of fear. It was the result of preparation, started long before anyone thought she was preparing. Brackett took her for a frightened widow he could pressure. She turned out to be the most prepared rancher in the country. He left town humiliated. She kept her land, and she got into the bargain the best husband her late husband could have wished for her. There's a lesson in that for any soul who's ever been threatened by a powerful man. Stand your ground, but stand it on paper, in advance, with friends in the right places. Then nobody on God's earth can move you.